Welcome back to the 10 Adventures podcast. Today we are talking exploration and transformation with Meghan Ward. Along the way, we talk about her book, Lights to Guide Me Home, as well as her recent film, Wildflowers, which is about Mary Schaeffer, a pioneer in the exploration of the Canadian Rockies. Hi, Meghan. Welcome to the show.
Hi. Thanks so much for having me today.
I'm excited to talk a little bit more about your film, but before we do so, can you maybe talk a little bit about yourself and your book, which is Lights to Guide Me Home, which is about your physical journey moving to the Rocky Mountains, but also how the Rocky Mountains and, the outdoors changed your life?
Sure. I grew up in Canada, Ontario, which is a suburb of Ottawa. And I like to say I grew up in that, delightful era of the 80s and 90s where we had an opportunity to play outside a lot of unstructured, unsupervised outdoor play. And but it was still that suburban existence. And I also grew up in a religious community that was very loving, but it led me to believe that I had this kind of prescription for my life, I think. So when I was in university, I remember I had a whole season of window washing. I think I was hired to wash windows and washed, 400 houses worth in a summer. And there was something about the experience that was really fun, but I think it left me yearning for a little bit more. And simultaneously that summer, I heard from a cousin who had been working in Banff National Park and how much she was enjoying the experience. And I think it just kind of sparked an idea in me that maybe there was something more out there for me. And I remember asking my dad about moving west, and it was something that he said an immediate yes to. And I think that set me on a course that I could never have anticipated, but it ultimately changed my life. And so when I was 21 years old, this is about 2005, I took a job in Banff National Park and moved to the mountains for the summer and worked at a mountain lodge that was remote enough that at the end of the day, when the tourists had gone home, it was just us and our guests. And it was there that I met a man who would eventually become my husband. His name is Paul Ziska. And through this series of events, I could sense my life was just getting kind of notched a little bit off the beaten track, one step at a time. And this sort of prescriptive life that I had imagined for myself growing up in a Christian community, maybe you go to school, you get married, you have kids, and have a little bit more of a traditional life, just started to fade into the background as I embraced this mountain lifestyle and the mountain life. And Paul was right there along the way, essentially, literally holding my hand through it all. I don't think he quite realized at the time just how impactful his presence was in my life. But it was through him I was introduced to hiking and climbing. And once you see the world from up high, there's really no turning back on what you've seen. You can't forget the experience, the exhilaration of seeing life in the Alpine, and it really changes your perspective on your life as you know it.
I love that statement. Once you see the world from up high, kind of your life changes. I've never heard that, and it's true. It's once you get up and you see these wild places, it's hard to kind of just go back and sit in office 24/7, isn't it?
Yes, it was the summer after my second year of university, so I still had 2 years to go. And I remember being back at Queen's University in the lecture hall in the month of February, looking at my textbooks and just dreaming of the mountains. I just couldn't wait to get back, which is what I did summer after summer until I graduated.
And so you moved out to Banff and kind of pursued this life of exploration. But as the book talks about, you had kind of like a second transformation when you started a family. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how your life changed kind of again?
Yeah, I'll also introduce the book to our listeners here. And so Lights to Guide Me Home takes the reader on a journey around the world while I track my transition through life's major milestones, such as marriage and motherhood, but it's told through the lens of someone who also adopted this adventurous spirit. And so after I finished school, I started pursuing a career in freelance writing and outdoor writing. which is something I'm still doing almost 20 years later. And so naturally, with the book, I found myself combining both my travel and outdoor experiences with what was happening on the inside, with the inner journey. So it's as though these travel experiences, and the book goes from Nepal to Costa Rica to Malta to Easter Island. Through these experiences, it's like they become the backdrop to this whole other story, which is about my personal transformation. And I think it's ultimately a story of a woman who feels like her life is being charted for her, to someone who charts her own path and who doesn't abandon herself in that process. And a big part of that was learning how to adapt my adventures to ones that would include children. And so in 2013, Paul and I welcomed our first daughter to the world. And we were really convinced that, one, we wanted to pursue a life of adventure with her, even when she was a baby, but also that we could, and it should go so smoothly. And we quickly learned that we had a lot to adapt when it came to traveling with young children. And she was a little bit of a tough one on us, not quite as adaptable as I think we would have liked. But the thing with parenthood is we don't get to choose that. Our children arrive as this gift that we unwrap and we discover what they have inside. And I think she definitely tested us. But over time, we learned how to adapt the way we traveled to her needs. And by the time she was about 2, we'd gotten into a really good groove and we were able to enjoy our trips together more.
It's funny, as you were talking, I was thinking back to in my 20s, I was down in El Chalten in Patagonia. And, you get off the bus, it's the middle, I think it's midnight. And there's, there was only a few hostels there. And there was one couple that had a newborn or, a 6-month-old baby. And they just pitched their tent right beside where the bus dropped us off. And I remember looking over, I think the wife had, a massive pack and the husband had a massive pack with a baby on top. And I thought, oh, this is totally doable. And so when we had kids, just assumed, oh, all these things, like I saw that couple, it's easy. Like, we're not going to go camp in the night in Chalten, and realize kind of a bit like it's actually way more difficult to do this. I'm interested. What are some of the tips or what are some of the things you've learned about doing adventures with kids to make it rewarding and deal with the challenges that invariably happen, with little kids or even, with teenagers?
That's a great question. And thankfully, we've traveled enough. I think we've been to about 35 countries with our kids now. And we've got 2 kids now, ages 6 and 11, that I've compiled a variety of tricks that now almost seem to run like a second brain, but I'll try to articulate some. One of the things we learned early on was not to move around too much. So our very first trip with our daughter when she was a year old was to Polynesia in New Zealand. And we were hopping around like crazy. I think we moved every 2 to 5 days. And even for an adaptable baby, I think that would probably be too much, that their whole world is being shaken up. And as much as kids are adaptable, I think, especially for kids who aren't as adaptable, we can take a couple variables out of the equation by just sticking around a little longer in each place. And so when our daughter turned 2, we actually went to Belize. We ended up on Key Cocker, which is a pretty small island, for 3 weeks. We were there for 3 weeks and got to know the locals and rented bikes and, had a blast. And as much as we felt a little bit stir crazy at times, we actually were able to enjoy it. We were able to settle into the place. And also because some days you have good days, some days you have bad days. When you're there for too short of time, the bad days take away from it so much more when you can kind of afford to have those when you're there for a couple weeks. And I've also learned that when you can travel with a partner, I'm so fortunate that Paul, and I are both equally committed to doing this with our kids. We've actually learned to pass the baton a little bit more. And so instead of trying to do everything together, we'll tag team a bit more and say, okay, well, why don't you take them for a few hours and I'll go do some writing, or I'll go see that on my own, or I'll take our oldest kid here and you can play with the youngest here. And it has really saved us in a lot of circumstances where, especially we have 5-year age gap between our kids. We might not want to take our baby into a cathedral, but maybe our oldest wants to see it. So it's such a good compromise.
I love those tips. I also want to come back to something you said, and you talked about kind of like having your life charted versus this idea of charting your own path. And I've talked to so many people who are living lives that they don't like, often, with lots of things they don't need. And I've always wondered, like, why do some people just take the initiative and kind of change their life, and why do some don't? In your case, why do you think you were able to make this big change, whereas so many people seem stuck with it?
It's such a great question, and I certainly can relate to what you're saying. I don't know if I've ever quite figured out what inspired me to step so far off the beaten track from the life I knew. I just know I'm grateful. I'm just grateful that when I saw that door open, I had the courage to step through it and see what was on the other side. And honestly, I think it's been a series of doors. It feels like hundreds of doors I've walked through when I have questions, I have fears, and something compels me. Maybe it's the act of taking that first step, of going through that first door, that gives you the courage to step through the next one and the next one, the next one. It's like a muscle you have to train, I think.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. I've never thought of it that way, but you're right. It isn't one decision. It's, hundreds of little small ones that each kind of get you farther out. I wanted to move over to talking about your recent film, Wildflowers, which was just at the Banff Mountain Film Festival. I think it was at the Kendall Film Festival for our UK listeners, and also the Whistler Film Festival. So kind of all the great mountain film festivals. And it tells the story of Mary Schaeffer. And can you maybe talk a little bit about what drew you to Mary as a subject for a film?
When I first moved to Banff National Park in 2005, it didn't take long to come across the name Mary Schaeffer. She is a legendary figure in mountain lore, and she's so remarkable because of what she accomplished in a time when, for one, women just were not doing what she did in the outdoors and in the backcountry. But also there was a lot against her, just culturally, by way of her gender, her status, being raised in an upper middle class family. So the first time I encountered Mary's story, it was the story of her exploration of Maligne Lake in Jasper National Park, which is the element of her story she is most associated with. And so you can imagine a well-to-do woman who wears the skirt until she's out of sight, tosses it into the woods, I don't know where, stuffs her hat in the bottom of the bag, and rides into the wilderness with pants on. And she was part of a small cohort of women who were doing this. Largely, she traveled with male guides because they were the only ones guiding at the time, but also guides who weren't her husband or family. And so this was also quite scandalous. And she would set off on these multi-week expeditions in the Canadian Rockies. And like I said, she was mostly associated with her 1908 expedition in which she was on a quest to find Maligne Lake, then also known as Chaba Imne, which is the Stoney Nakoda word. But once I dug into Mary's story more, I also learned that she was this American woman who was raised as a Quaker and had come to the Canadian Rockies with her first husband named Charles Schaeffer, who was a botanist, with the goal of cataloging different botanical species. And she was a very talented watercolor artist. who worked with Charles to photograph and do watercolors of the wildflowers. And so there's all these little tidbits of her life that just attracted me to her, both as an adventurous spirit, but also a creative person. And then it's her book, which is called Old Indian Trails. It was published in 1911, in which she catalogs her journey to Maligne Lake and throughout the Canadian Rockies. And so we have all these really juicy bits from her history that we can actually access today. And I think naturally I was attracted to such a remarkable woman. As a filmmaker and a writer, I was also attracted to her story because of just the sheer wealth of material we have available at our fingertips that helps us to bring her story to an audience.
Around the same time, the Alpine Club of Canada was started by, again, a kind of a trailblazing woman, Elizabeth Parker. When I was watching your film, I thought, oh, like, there's two people that are really kind of doing things that are, challenging cultural norms significantly at that time. What do you think it was like, or, why do you think these two women were able to really challenge cultural norms in a male-dominated environment that even today, the outdoors is still male-dominated? We just had our first president being female at the Alpine Club of Canada. It's been around for 120 years. What was about Mary and Elizabeth that enabled them to, again, kind of chart their own course, as you said earlier?
Yeah, Mary and Elizabeth had a variety of contemporaries, from Gertrude Benham, Henrietta Tuzzo, Mary Vaux. There's just so many incredible women that you can read about today who definitely pushed against a lot of barriers. I think this kind of goes a little bit to that question you asked earlier when I talked about the door. I don't necessarily see myself as a visionary in this sense, but I think every generation has its visionaries who can see beyond the horizon. And some of these women, I think, possessed the personality, especially when I look at Mary Schaeffer. She was known to be very opinionated, very strong-willed. She had a lot of gusto. And interestingly, she struggled in her female friendships as well. Outside of the mountain circle, she really struggled to fit in within her own class and society in Banff or back in Philly, where she was raised. And so that tells me that there was something in her, like that X factor that can be a little bit of a turnoff for some people, but ultimately can mean that you're someone who's going to make things happen for yourself. And I think we see this across various generations, both with men and women.
The film talks about how Mary reinvented herself. And you've alluded to it, she was a prim and proper East Coast, middle-class woman, and then she was out in the woods. Can you maybe describe a little bit more why you think she made this change? What drew her to challenge convention and do these incredible journeys?
I talked earlier about this record that Mary Schaeffer has left for us so that we're not left guessing. In Old Indian Trails, she doesn't reveal as much about her motivations behind going into these wilderness spaces. She does talk a lot about her reverence for the wilderness and the escape it is from the city life and all of those things. I love how she talks about bacon in the backcountry, like any hungry adventurer would savor, right? But it's in letters later in her life that she articulates something about what motivated her to go into the wilderness. In 1903, her first husband passed away, and she was only 43. He was 2 decades older than her. And also that same year, she lost her parents. And I think Mary was really grieving. She talks about basically how no one may know I went among those hills with a broken heart. This is in a letter to an acquaintance that she was corresponding with in the 1920s. And the quote continues to say, "They like to say explorer of me, but no, only a hunter of peace. I found it." And this quote has become quite famous a lot of people don't realize it's actually not from her book. It's from a private letter that's now in the White Museum archives. And I think Mary herself is telling us there that she went into the wilderness as a place of healing. She went to commune with the people that she had lost. And I love that she says that she found it, that she found that sense of healing in these beautiful spaces.
Wow, that's beautiful. I didn't realize that was the genesis for this. Your film retraces the end of Mary's 1908 expedition, and I wonder if you can maybe share her overall route and then the part of the route that you retraced.
In 1907, Mary Schaeffer set off for a multi-month expedition through the Canadian Rockies with Billy Warren, her guide, and later her husband. So Mary Schaeffer is also known as Mary Schaeffer Warren because she married Billy Warren. They had a cook and wrangler with them named Sid Unwin, as well as her good friend Molly Adams. And they had set off on a multi-week expedition with the goal along the way, amongst many goals, of finding this elusive lake named Chaba Imne. And they were unable to find the lake that summer, but as chance would have it, she encountered someone on the Kootenay Plains at the end of that season named Samson Beaver, who was from the Goodstoney First Nation, and he had visited the lake in his youth. And so when Mary found this out, she actually asked him if he could draw her a map. And it's quite an interesting exchange that occurs. There's definitely some colonial undertones to the way in which Mary talks to Samson and ultimately convinces him to create this map for her. And in the end, he did. And it was ultimately the key that unlocked the journey to Maligne Lake. Chaba Imne is now known as Maligne Lake, the following summer. And so in 1908, Mary set off with the same crew. And in addition, they had a botanist named Thurston Brown and his guide, Reggie Holmes, with them. So there were 6 of them. And they set off from Lagan, which is now known as Lake Louise area, north through the backcountry reaches of present-day Banff and Jasper National Parks to eventually the shores of Maligne Lake, and then onward up to Mount Robson before they journeyed back home. And so the portion that we retraced was quite a small portion in terms of the scale of the trails that she had covered and the thousands of kilometers she covered. But our journey took us from the Pabocton Creek trailhead on the Icefields Parkway, about 45 kilometers through the Maligne River Valley, to the mouth of the Maligne as the river opens into Maligne Lake. And then a day of paddling on the lake itself to retrace part of their journey on the lake before we exited at the Maligne boat docks.
And when Mary Schaeffer did this, it's kind of, anyone who's hiked or backpacked in the Rockies, there's trails that, there's campsites. Was she just following game trails when she was looking for Maligne Lake?
Her book is an indication. The title of it is called Old Indian Trails. And what's interesting about Mary is that despite the time she was living in, she never really claims to have discovered anything. She was very aware of whose path she was following. And so they were in the valley itself, which sometimes, when you're in, they had 22 horses with them. They had all the equipment that they needed for several weeks on the trail. When you're in a valley, you have this natural path you're following, even if it's not very obvious, in that they're following the actual course of the river. And where the trees come down, they're naturally on the kind of, there's a lot of meadows through the Maligne River Valley. But there were indications along the way that they were on the right path. One being, there's an image in Mary Schaeffer's collection where what is close now to, it's called Mary Schaeffer Camp, there were teepee poles in her image. And part of our journey with our crew was to actually do repeat photography of several images in Mary's collection. So we had tasked our photographer, Natalie Gillis, with the creation of these repeat photos. And so we have one of this exact spot where in Mary's photo, there are the teepee poles, and in Natalie's photo, there are not. There's overgrown willows and evergreens. So she was following in their path. She often took a cue from stands of teepee poles that this would be a good place to camp. And sure enough, it was. It's close to, it's close to a water source. It's in a nice flat area. And then she, of course, had Samson Beaver's map. And she had the piece of paper with her along the way, which roughly indicated the route to Maligne Lake.
Now, after Mary completed this expedition, what happened in her life?
After Mary completed the expedition, for one, she decided to write about it. Eventually, she published a book in 1911 called Old Indian Trails. She also compiled her photographs, and they weren't all taken by her. A lot of the images in her collection were also taken by other members of her expedition. But Mary applied her watercolor skills to actually hand painting the glass plates and adding color, which we can enjoy today. She would often go on the road with these and do slideshows. So she would travel around and give presentations about her journeys through the Canadian Rockies and have these slides. Eventually, she also, during the war, she actually shipped a set overseas with a script, so that the Banff boys fighting in the war and the Canadians over there, the Brits could actually enjoy her photographs in the slideshow and bring them a little bit of joy in a tough time. She eventually married Billy Warren and settled in Banff in 1915. And Billy really wanted to be a provider for her. So though she kept creating, kept writing, we have these unpublished manuscripts of hers because Billy didn't really want her to be making money off of them. He didn't really want her to work. So all of her slideshows were done as a volunteer or for charity. And she still seemed quite happy with this arrangement. I think she just liked being taken care of. But we have all this wonderful material from her that a lot of people have never seen. And I'd have to say, her mountain life, as an explorer was actually quite short, maybe like 8 to 10 years. And after that, she moves more into being very community oriented. This was a time when cars were first coming into the Canadian Rockies and they were building roads so people could go sightseeing. And she would hire a chauffeur and get them to take her sightseeing to like Minnewanka or up the Icefields Parkway when it was first being built. And so she moved out of that life of adventure, but she, I think, was really comfortable with reinventing herself at various stages. And eventually she just became very community oriented. She loved having the young people over to her house to play bridge. And she's noted in the paper numerous times alongside Billy's name as a philanthropist. And so I think she always found new ways to engage with the people in her life.
I'm interested. What did you learn from retracing Mary's route and making this film?
This is like the ultimate question, and it's been well over a year since this expedition, and I've been tracking Mary's story for 20 years, and I'm not sure I've quite landed on an answer. Of course, there's a lot we learned from retracing it by way of the repeat photography we were doing along the way and noting the changes in the glaciers and the tree line and just the ways in which people have moved through the wilderness. There's the very kind of tangible aspects of it. I think one thing I learned is just as a historian and a human, it is really important to look back because we can't really change the past, but there's so much we can draw from it. It's like drawing from a well. And it's right there waiting for us. And it brings value to Mary's life. And it's important to look at her as a trailblazer. But I also learned through her story that Mary's lifespan really overlapped with an era of real colonial influence and impact in the Canadian Rockies that, of course, we're still feeling the impacts of today, that our Indigenous people are still dealing with today. It's everything we're reconciling with now. But by looking back, we're also able to blaze that better trail forward and to just really look at history with fresh eyes, to not fall into the trap of telling stories the same way. I think Mary is a remarkable person, but there were also some things that were problematic about the way she went about things and some of the things that she said about Indigenous people and the settler community in general, and the impact that would have had, that we know that it had. And by looking back, we can find a better way forward. And I think it's really important work that we need to be doing today. That's something that I really took away from this whole experience, was the call in my own life to do better.
Wow, that's so powerful. Meghan, thanks for coming on the show today. It's been great to talk about transformation and the outdoors and learn more about your book and your film.
Thank you so much for the experience. It's been wonderful.
And if people want to find your book or find your film, or you do a bunch of other stuff, you're like a Renaissance woman doing 20 different things, it seems, where can they find more about you?
Sure. My website is at meghanjoyward.com, and I'm at Meghan, if you're curious. On Instagram at Meghan J. Ward. And if you're curious about the film, go to wildflowersfilm.ca. We have a page there where you can sign up for notifications for when we're offering new screenings and streaming. So it's a great place to get all that intel.
Thanks, Meghan. I'll put links to all those in the show notes. And with that, thank you for listening to this episode of the 10 Adventures podcast. We'll be back next week to explore the world and hear about more epic adventures. Start planning your own adventure by visiting us at 10adventures.com and listen to other episodes of the 10 Adventures podcast on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you find your podcasts.